I'm Noah Abrams, and welcome to The Days Between, the show where I talk to my friends, people I admire, and people I want to better understand about success, failure, happiness, and misery, as well as all the other elements that make up a life well lived. Along the way, we'll look at mental, spiritual, and physical health, and when life didn't go as planned, the steps they took to get themselves from A to B and beyond. This week, I'm speaking with Chef Sean Sherman. Growing up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, Sean had plenty of time to explore the wide open spaces provided by the South Dakota Badlands. Equipped with a natural curiosity, Sean developed an extensive knowledge of the edible flora surrounding him, which he has utilized throughout his career. Self-taught, Sean learned to cook at a young age, using available ingredients and a healthy dose of creativity. Rising through the ranks of the Minneapolis food scene of the early 2000s, Sean found himself in an executive chef position in just a few short years. Having reached a point of being overworked and burnt out, he packed a bag and headed to Mexico. Encounters with the native Huichol sparked a passion to learn more about his own culinary heritage, which would ultimately result in Sean opening the Tatanka food truck and his restaurant, Owamni. A 3-time James Beard Award winner, Sean founded the nonprofit Natives with a mission, among other goals, to educate tribal communities and younger generations about indigenous culture in an effort to counter centuries of American colonialism. During the course of our conversation, we discuss hustling sushi, his chosen moniker, the sous chef, and why he doesn't serve fry bread. Please enjoy Chef Sean Sherman on The Days Between. So I'm here in Minneapolis, Minnesota with Chef Sean Sherman. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So you've spent a large portion of your professional career here in Minneapolis, but you are not from here originally.
That is correct. I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I did high school and college in a little town called Spearfish in the northern Black Hills in South Dakota, and I moved out to Minneapolis when I was about 23.
Any siblings?
I'm the oldest of 6.
And you all grew up in Pine Ridge?
No, my next youngest sister and I grew up on Pine Ridge, and then my dad had other children, and they grew up in other places, mostly Montana.
So your parents had split up?
Yes.
Tell me about growing up in Pine Ridge.
You know, Pine Ridge Reservation is a lot of open space. You're basically in the Great Plains, so you can imagine it's a lot of big, open, wide spaces. You can see clouds. You can see storms coming for hours away. Lots of grassland. And Pine Ridge is also on what is called the Badlands in South Dakota, which is really deserty kind of area and a really interesting space. I remember finding lots of dinosaur bones and stuff like that growing up. And even a lot of artillery shells, because the Air Force Base in Rapid City used a lot of the Badlands as target practice. So we'd be crawling around and finding like huge artillery shells and just be like grabbing them, like, look what I found. Parenting in the 70s was loose. I think it was probably looser on the reservation. I teased my parents for not really raising us, but just kicking us outside till dark. So we were pretty feral. We just ran around. We got into trouble like a lot of kids did. And we just had a lot of fun outdoors because TV wasn't the option. And it was just being outside.
How'd you start cooking?
I started cooking when my mom moved us off the reservation because we were pretty latchkey, and I was the oldest, so I was cooking at home. And then I got my first job at a restaurant when I just turned 13 in South Dakota, and that just kind of set me on that path of being in the restaurants.
Was it a creative expression that young, or was it more utilitarian?
I would say it was creative because we didn't have like a lot of stuff. So I learned how to make things like sloppy joes using basically just ketchup and mustard and some spices in the spice drawer, and trying to mimic things like if we didn't have taco seasoning but we had some hamburger, I would just like save those packages and look at the ingredients and try to mimic those flavors. So kind of out of necessity, I had to be creative. Once I got into restaurants, I started learning a lot more tricks really quickly, especially just working in the back of the house.
Was it a passion, you think?
I wouldn't necessarily say it was a passion back then. It was more a necessity just because my mom was raising 2 kids, going to school, working 3 jobs. And I was mostly working just to have some spending money at the time and helping out where I could. For me, I just spent all my high school career working in restaurants, so lots of tourist restaurants in the northern Black Hills. And then after college, I moved to Minneapolis and continued working restaurants where I started to find a lot more creativity and I gained a lot more skills really quickly. Within, I would say 3.5 years of living in the city, I worked my way up to an executive chef position.
And what kind of restaurants were you working in?
When I moved to Minneapolis, my first job was at Mall of America, which was very short stinted because it didn't take me very long to realize I did not want to be at the Mall of America every day. And then I did find a job at a local Italian family-owned restaurant that just made all its own pasta. We basically had a bunch of recipes straight out of Marcella Hazan's cookbooks, and I just really learned kind of healthy country-style Italian cuisine first.
I've heard you say that your first job outside of high school was working for the Forest Service.
So right when I graduated high school, my senior year, at the end of that summer, that's when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service. And my job was a field surveyor, so they would just basically give me an aerial photo map, and we'd drive up into whichever region of the northern Black Hills we were working at. And then depending on the acreage of that map, I would have to plot out a certain amount of pinpoints, and then I'd have to hike to those exact pinpoints and do a survey. So I'd take an 11-foot radius and then have to write down every tree and plant within that circle and age everything and just record it. So I had to learn the names of the plants, the trees, how to age them, and I had tools to see how tall trees were and things like that. I loved that job because I just got to walk 6 miles a day in the forest, basically. I would pack a lunch. I had 2 water bottles on me. I'd keep one frozen because it would melt throughout the day, and I'd always have cold water on hand. And then I would just sit down in the middle of the forest at lunch hour and just enjoy lunch by myself, by wherever I thought was a cool spot. And I'd keep my eyes open as I learned plants. I started identifying berries and things. So I remember just sitting in a patch of wild currants and just enjoying lunch and eating right off the ground and just being really connected to the forest.
Would you say that was your first time really paying attention to the plants and the environment around you?
I think in an educational standpoint, yes. But growing up outside, we were always very curious about plants because they were just around us. We were always outdoors. We saw the cactus growing in the Great Plains. We knew some of the plants here and there that you could kind of chew on or things like that. We knew some plants growing up, but it wasn't really until that was part of my job and it forced me to learn these names and start to see a lot more edibility. And then that just kind of set the foundation for what became later in life.
Now, when you had moved to Minneapolis in the early 2000s, that was the beginning, sort of the farm to table movement. Did that education come in handy at that point?
Well, I moved from South Dakota to Minneapolis around late 96, I believe it was. And then I was a chef by the early 2000s. And I did get lucky working pretty quickly after that into farm-to-table restaurants. And I did start really paying attention to what people were growing and started using foragers, started using people just growing lots of local stuff, And eventually, very quickly, I kind of started working in a restaurant model where I basically cut out big box trucks and only used local everything, whatever is proteins and vegetables and whatever people were bringing in the door, and just try to keep it really super local. And that was just a good practice, for me, because the growers that we had around us were growing really interesting vegetables that you would never find in some of those big box trucks. And, I had really good relationships with some of the protein growers out there, whether it's poultry or lamb or beef or whatever. And even some of the more organic, small, independent butcher shops, I would just call them up every week and just be like, what do you have to move? And they would say, we have all this stuff. And I'd just figure out what to do with it and put it on the menu that week. So that kind of set the tone for utilizing a lot of varied vendors, I would say, and just being a lot more open to creating recipes with what was on hand.
What was going on with you personally at this time?
When I first became a chef was about the time I met my son's mom. Her name was Melissa. We got married right after we had our son, Phoenix, and that was in 2002. So we were just a young couple. We were both in our early 30s at that point, and a baby and a new career and just kind of moving forward. And I was still at that point, because I was a brand new chef, I didn't really choose that career, just kind of fell into it because I didn't really think I was going to be a chef. I thought I was going to do something different, especially I wanted to do something in art more. But it just kind of forced me to really focus on what it meant to become a chef. And I had to teach myself everything I couldn't afford an education. I couldn't go to school for cooking. I didn't have the money for that. So I remember just sitting in some of the bookstores and pulling books off the shelves and in my downtime and just reading and recording recipes in my head, and then going back and utilizing that education and just putting those books back, not even purchasing them. I had a pretty quick but decent chef career, worked at a few different restaurants in South Minneapolis and downtown Minneapolis. And one particular restaurant job, I was working for a large fitness corporation that had locations all across the country, based out of here in Minnesota. And I was overseeing 4 restaurants in the Minneapolis region, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And on top of that, helping to design recipes and menus for about 65 fitness locations across the country. And it was a really intense job, and I worked way too many hours, and I did hit kind of a little bit of a burnout spot. So when I left that job, I just took a breath, grabbed a backpack and a guitar, and moved down to Mexico.
Tell me about Mexico.
So I had been going down to Jalisco and Puerto Vallarta with Melissa back then, who's now my ex-wife. And Puerto Vallarta was still pretty small back then. It was kind of like Old Town, and like Nuevo Vallarta hadn't even really come up. It was just kind of foundations of hotels being built at that point. And it was still kind of an old feeling of kind of a smaller like vacation spot. And then we started exploring a lot of the small towns in that region back then, and just kind of going up and down the coast and around that bay, looking just to see what was out there and just exploring. And we ended up in a small town called Sayulita, about a half hour north of Puerto Vallarta. That's now become very popular, and it's really kind of overrun by all the yoga studios and smoothie shops and things like that, as you see in Mexico. So when I moved down to Mexico, the intention was to move down to Sayulita because it was still pretty small back then. There was just a couple restaurants on the beach, and there wasn't that much activity quite yet. But then something fell through with the place we had, and we ended up looking, like scrounging around to find a place to stay, and ended up in San Pancho, which was one town north of there. And just kind of fell in love with that little town because it was really quiet. It was really kind of family driven. There was literally just like one palapa restaurant on the beach, and just like, you know, it's like a 2-mile long beach with like nobody there. And it was just a beautiful, idyllic, you know, jungle town on the beach.
Tell me about hustling sushi.
When I left the city and we moved down the first time, I was down there for about 4 months, I want to say. And I was looking for something to do to bring us back so we could just like try to live down there. And I fell into working with this American who was kind of an expat. He had some family that was living down there, and they had a lot of property in that area. This guy was just kind of an old hippie. He was growing out a bunch of old heirloom seeds. He was just growing a bunch of cool foods, you know, but he didn't know what to do with them. He just liked to grow the foods. He didn't know what to do with them after that. So I started helping with like making them into things and doing some pop-up dinners with them and stuff like that. And then we had a plan to come back the next year, and they wanted to open up a restaurant like in the farm, which would have been really kind of cool to see like all of this cool stuff growing around you and have a few tables and a kitchen in the middle of the farm. So I went back to the States, worked a chef job for the summer in the Black Hills. The first time I'd returned to South Dakota since moving away. Moved back down to Mexico, and it happened to be right at the housing crash. So everything just kind of came to a screeching halt. Then we were down there with trying to figure out what to do. Like I had some money saved up to last for a little while, but we weren't really sure what we were going to do. So I just started like putting myself out there. I remember I put up a Craigslist ad as a sushi caterer, and you know, a couple times a month I would get hit up by some tourists, and you know, I would just sling some sushi. I got to know some of the fishermen in that beach town, so I'd catch them early in the morning. Like I'd go down there like at 7 in the morning as they were coming out of the ocean with their catches, and I would buy like a whole like mahi or whatever fresh from them for the equivalent of about $7 for the entire fish. And I would just take that back, break it down, and I could turn that into about $500 of sushi.
Was this your first exposure to the Huichol?
Yeah, because as I was down there, they were always like selling a lot of really beautiful beadwork down by the beach. They had a very particular way of dress and look about them. They looked very indigenous, you know. And I just became very curious when I was down there, and I started reading a lot. And as I was kind of just learning about them and trying to understand the history of this particular group down there, it I saw these commonalities, because I saw some of their ceremonies were very particular, that were very similar, I should say, to what I grew up with on Pine Ridge. Like they had sweats like we had sweats. And then they also, a lot of their beadwork and mythology, just really rich and vibrant. And the artwork we have really vibrant beadwork too in Lakota territory. And I just saw a lot of these commonalities, and something just clicked. I just realized that they were just kind of like long distance indigenous cousins, from North America too. And it got me thinking about my next steps as a chef. And like I had been spending all this time researching all these different cuisines from around the world and really deep diving into other cultures and trying to understand them. And then realized I knew very little about what Lakota food was. That was missing completely from my thought process at the time. And I just started trying to figure out what that meant.
I want to sidestep for a minute here and talk about your great-grandfather.
Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about him?
Yeah, I use him as an example a lot in my talks. So my great-grandfather, I know that he was born in either the very late 1850s or very early 1860s, and that he was 18 during the Battle of Little Bighorn. And he grew up on the plains with the Lakota. At that time, the Lakota, at least where our family was from, they were living with what was Crazy Horse's group. And they were mostly living out in the Powder River area, which is kind of along the side of the Bighorn Mountains into kind of like central western Wyoming. And they had a large spread because they moved all over the place. They moved a little ways up into Montana, all the way down into South Dakota, even down into parts of Colorado. And they were just had a large area that they moved around in. And the Black Hills were still a very sacred space. So it was a very sacred space where a lot of Lakota would come together for ceremonies amongst other groups. So I just used him as an example because when I started thinking about who was the last in my family line to have 100% of their indigenous knowledge intact, how long ago was that? And it was just my great-grandfather's generation, because he grew up Lakota, learning everything a Lakota boy would have had to learn, which is how to hunt, how to fish, how to gather, how to identify plants, how to create weapons, how to create clothing, like anything that would have been part of the education being indigenous at that time in that part of the world. And, just seeing so much change in that single lifetime, seeing all these battles, especially between Crazy Horse and the U.S. government. And then also just knowing that he saw a lot of the Lakota get pushed onto Pine Ridge Reservation. He saw his children grow up and have to go into boarding schools at the turn of the century, having to cut their hair, learn how to speak English, learn Christianity, and just see like the loss of so much culture within that single lifetime, and even seeing some of his kids grow up and fight for the U.S. government. So I just feel like there's just so much to witness in that one particular lifetime, and I have other people in my family tree that also went through that very similar time period, but I just use him as an example. And, I just think it's really powerful to think that that wasn't very long ago. I wasn't digging deepwards into history. I wasn't going 500 years back. I was just going to my great-grandparents' generation.
Well, you talk about the loss of Lakota knowledge, and you mentioned the boarding schools. Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I believe the gentleman's name was Pratt, if I remember correctly, and he had taken prisoners of war and tried to create a system to show that he could assimilate them into no longer basically becoming indigenous. And basically all he was really doing was using photography as a trick, because he would show them when they were prisoners of war, a bit disheveled and all the things, and take a picture, and then he would clean them up, cut their hair, put a suit on them, make them look like the modern day dress, and then take a picture of them. And then he got a lot of funding to create a school system to attempt to do this on younger children. I want to say it starts in the early 1890s. I don't remember the exact date on that, but it's around that time period. It's just this military-run school. It's being paid for by the U.S. government, and there's just a lot of really harsh way of life there for a lot of these students, because a lot of these students are forced to be there. A lot of families were forced to give up their children, basically being blackmailed by saying, if you don't send your children to these boarding schools, then you won't get any rations. So a lot of people were forced to put their kids into train cars and things like that and ship them off across to, the very first one, which starts in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Carlisle Indian School. And I visited Carlisle, a few years back just to kind of see what was going on. And there was one lady that was working at the museum there who just had so much history, like years of history she had been digging up about the school and about the way it was. And, some of the interesting pieces are like that particular school had some of the most expensive medical equipment in the entire nation, because Richard Pratt was a firm believer of phrenology, and he wanted to prove white supremacy. And they were literally doing experiments on these young children. And so there was a lot of death that happened there. And they used to have this massive graveyard where all the students were buried when they did pass away there. And the school later decided it took up too much space on their land, so they moved the graveyard to a much smaller plot that cut it down to about a third of its size, I believe, and just removed all the bodies. But they're all mixed up, because some tribes have been trying to get some of their bodies to come back home to the particular communities that they were taken from, and they're having a hard time like discerning some of these bodies now because of the just awful and disrespectful way that they did that whole situation. And, again, like even in that area of Pennsylvania, like looking at some of the maps at the museum, like even at the early part of the 1800s, and like I saw a map of 1830. And if you look at the western side of Ohio and Pennsylvania and that area, there's still a massive amount of indigenous communities living out there that are on the maps, So again, it just kind of paints this picture that like, people always say like, oh, things change, everything was so long ago, but it's not, because this study really became an understanding of how violent and intense the 1800s were, and just how much segregation and racism continued to perpetuate throughout the 1900s, which is why we are here today where we are now, where we don't have Native American restaurants in every single city. And many people in the United States probably think Native Americans don't even exist.
So you have this realization in Mexico. How did you go about filling in those gaps in your knowledge?
So when I first started, I wasn't really sure where to start. Of course, I took to the internet because I was down in Mexico and I just was looking for information. I couldn't find any Native American restaurants at that time period. And I did find a couple of books online that dealt with indigenous foods, but they weren't exactly what I was looking for, because I was looking for something that wasn't fusionized. I wanted something that delved in deeper to the knowledge of plants that people were utilizing, and agriculture, and what kind of seeds people were growing and who was growing and things like that. And I remember asking my mom if she had any family recipes or cookbooks that were passed down from her parents or anything like that. And I remember she's like, oh yeah, I've got a Pine Ridge cookbook you can have. And I got that cookbook from her eventually. And I was very disappointed because it was basically a Lutheran cookbook. And I use this as an example all the time. I'd be like, Mom, I'm trying to find recipes that don't have cream of mushroom soup in it. I want to know like what were we really eating out there? Because we obviously weren't eating bags of wheat flour and butter and cream of mushroom soup and all these things. So it just really sent me on a path to understand. But because I had that education with the Forest Service and really connecting with the plants, like I really understood that my ancestors would have had a vast knowledge and education about the world around them, about the plants, especially because it's used for everything, for food, for medicine, for making weapons and tools and clothing and lodging and all the things. So I started there. I started with the ethnobotany side of things.
And then how many years passed before you made your way back to Minneapolis and started the sous chef?
So I think I started going down to Mexico around 2007-ish, and I ended up in Montana shortly after Mexico for a few years. I think I finally moved back to Minnesota around 2011, and I officially opened up the sous chef, or at least officially formed it in 2014 early.
And tell me about the sous chef.
After having the epiphany, after spending some time in Montana and just kind of really reconnecting with nature and starting to play with more wild foods and really delving into filling up my head with a bunch of history and ethnobotany and things like that, and really trying to have a basic understanding of what Native American foods were, I started attempting to do some pop-up dinners when I moved back to Minnesota. At first, I landed up in Bemidji, Minnesota for a few months and was just kind of experimenting and putting some dinners together there. And then I moved back down to Minneapolis, just took a chef job to have to keep things going, but started on the side actively doing some catering events and things like that, and just attempting to try and see how I wanted to do this and how I wanted to form. And I didn't really think of the sous chef name until Well, I didn't start to use it until a little bit later because I had the sous chef as an email moniker because I had sous chef at Hotmail, sous chef at Gmail, sous chef at AOL, just to date myself on that. I thought it was just a funny play on words, but as I was trying to think of like a name for an indigenous company to create, I ended up just coming back to that because it just seemed to fit in. Because originally I wanted to find something that kind of blended both Dakota and Anishinaabe because I was in Minnesota and I wanted something that would cross over, and there really wasn't any crossover words. And using an English term just made it sound like a yoga studio because I'd just be like grandfather's table or something like that. And I just, wanted it to be something different, and then I was like, I'm just going to use a sous chef and see what happens.
In 2015, you started the Tatanka truck.
So in 2014, I officially quit my last chef job I had here in Minnesota and Minneapolis and started working for myself full-time towards the end of 2014. And right away, I started getting catering asks. I started getting a lot of media requests all right off the bat. And I started getting asks to talk about this. And I didn't know anything about doing that kind of work. So I had to teach myself how to do PowerPoint and utilize that. And that became a big part of what I do. And one of the very first talks I did here in the cities, a couple of people sat in and listened, and they were really kind of taken aback by the approach I was talking about with really trying to understand indigenous foods and trying to move it into the now. So they were working with the Little Earth community of United Tribes in South Minneapolis here, which is an urban native community. And they had just purchased a food truck, and they didn't really know what to do with it, but they wanted to do something interesting. They wanted it to use it for job creation. They wanted to see healthy foods come out of it. And everybody they asked wanted to just turn it into a fry bread truck. When they started talking, they thought it was a perfect fit.
Can you talk about fry bread?
Sure. Some of the philosophy that I set in order to showcase what indigenous foods were was to try not to fusionize it, was to try and cut away influence. So I tried to cut away European influence specifically and removed things like wheat flour, dairy product, cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken. Really tried to focus on what people were utilizing and identify what was the indigenous pantry of this particular land space that I was here. What kind of carbohydrates were people utilizing? What kind of wild greens and wild seasonings, and what kind of proteins and birds and fish, and what kind of cooking techniques and food preservation techniques were people using? Where were people getting salts and fats and sugars and all those kinds of questions? So fry bread didn't fit into that equation because fry bread history doesn't go back that far. I think you can pretty much pinpoint it to being shown to the Dene during the Long Walk of the Navajo in, I believe, the 1860s. And it's just something that the U.S. cavalry showed a lot of the prisoners of war of something to do with some very simple rations. So if you have something like bulk flour and no oven, basically you can just make a very simple dough out of very little, like flour, salt, water, if even. And then all you really need is something to cook it on. So you can grill it or you can throw it in a pan with some fat and fry it up, and it becomes something that's very tasty. And I remember asking my aunt, who was born in the 30s and grew up her entire life and lived her entire life on Pine Ridge, when she remembered fry bread coming onto Pine Ridge. And she said she can't remember it before the late 60s, maybe even the early 1970s. So right before I was born, fry bread hadn't even been around Pine Ridge that long. So for me, it seemed kind of weird to cut out something like fry bread because it was something that I grew up with and we just all knew it as this is native food. But after I did all this research, I realized it didn't carry that much history and there was so much more to showcase and to share.
And I've heard you say that the style of cooking, or at least the goal, was not to cook like it was 1491, like it wasn't a museum piece.
Yeah, I really wanted to create something that showcased now, like what was today's indigenous food? What's modern indigenous food, and what's the future of indigenous food? I wanted to understand how people were doing things in the past, but I didn't want to just try and replicate that and recreate that because I didn't want it to feel like a museum piece. I didn't want it to feel like something that was old and unattainable. I wanted it to be something that was now and right around us, and to really showcase the true value of the knowledge that indigenous peoples had and still have and hold, to really give us tools and a blueprint to live sustainably with the world around us.
How was the Tatanka truck received?
Good. We were worried at first because a lot of people were excited that there was a Native American food truck opening, and most people assumed that would be fry bread. So we were a little bit worried if we were just going to piss off everybody across the board with no fry bread, but it actually worked out pretty well because we did what we did, and we held the philosophy of just trying to cook healthy indigenous food using what was around us, highlighting a lot of indigenous food products from indigenous food producers, using a lot more wild foods. We didn't have things like sodas and sports drinks and stuff like that. We pretty much did wild cedar tea, and we had kind of indigenous tacos that were corn based and using things like bison and venison and elk and rabbit and duck and geese and all sorts of freshwater lake fish from Minnesota, and lots of wild rice, of course, and just really try to showcase like what was possible for right now.
And then in 2017, you started the nonprofit Natives.
So I started coming up with the idea for Natives, and Natives kind of came about as I started this business. I started traveling around a lot. I was invited to speak at a lot of different areas. Some of them were tribal communities, some of them were food conferences, a lot of universities and higher education. So one particular piece where it really kind of came clear, where I started to really develop the vision, was we were invited to do a really special dinner in Denmark. And we went to the western side of Denmark in the region of Jutland. And we worked with this Danish folk school, which they called a Huichol. I think it was in Ringkøbing, if I remember the name of that town correctly. But anyways, one of the teachers, she had been a part of the Nordic Food Lab team for a while, and then she moved into working in education at this folk school. And she had Googled sustainable chef from the U.S. and somehow got my name, and then reached out and contacted and brought me in. So she was putting on this dinner, and the name of the dinner was The Catastrophic Meal. And it was basically a challenge for chefs that she invited to create a dish and to represent what is the status of food in 50 years, and giving us either a utopian or dystopian lens to play with. So each chef group, whatever they created, depended on those criteria. So there was a chef team from Nordic Food Lab. There was some chefs from Noma. There was a chef from the eastern side of Denmark. There was a chef from South Africa. There was chefs from Alicia Foundation, which was part of Al Buli, which was part of Ferran Adria's Test Kitchen, which is still a big NGO doing a lot of cool food work. And then there was people from the University of Gastronomy in Italy. There was a chef from Canada and myself, and we just put on this multi-course dinner, and it was invite only. It moved around this folk school during the dinner, and it was a really interesting project. But what I really liked about it was witnessing this folk school, because it took all these kids who were kind of in their early 20s into their 30s, some of them just kind of figuring out what are their next steps. And it gave them an opportunity to have further education without a lot of finances to worry about, because it was pretty low cost, and they could sign up for 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months. And it basically taught liberal arts. So there was like writing, theater, music, gardening, foraging, cooking, all these kinds of things. Something clicked, and I just saw the need for that for indigenous communities. I realized that we just don't have access to indigenous education, that all of our education system's been developed from American colonialism, which is why we don't learn anything about U.S. history really in our curriculum growing up. And we just don't have anything from the indigenous perspective when it comes to education. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could create something that would create a space for people to come, for people to show up to right out of high school, knowing that a lot of kids, especially in tribal communities, don't even make it through high school, and give them an opportunity to find something in the realm of indigenous education to move forward to, something that really speaks to them. Maybe it's culinary, maybe it's language, maybe it's crafting or beading or sewing or music or food preservation or gardening, farming, whatever it might be, just creating something for them to really learn from. So I started developing an idea of creating a nonprofit to do that work, because I knew that having a food truck or even working towards opening a restaurant here in Minneapolis, that would affect our community, but this was needed everywhere. And, also being able to see it on a pan-indigenous level where the colonial borders don't matter, this is also needed elsewhere, like not just in the US, but Canada, Mexico, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, Southeast Asia, Africa, India, wherever indigenous peoples have been affected by colonialism. So thinking on a large scale, like how can we create something that replicates itself and get this out there fast? And using my restaurant skills, knowing that like a famous burger joint can open up 200 units within a few short years. And how can we do that, but do that kind of model for good? How can we create something that's replicable and move it outwards? So I came up with the name NATIVES, which is the acronym North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And I modeled Indigenous Food Lab off of some of these other major food labs that were going on around the world with, at the time, Nordic Food Lab, which is now done, but Alicia Foundation, Slow Food of Gastronomy in Italy, and just trying to think about how do we create something that really focuses on indigenous peoples, but does it on a massive scale, like a pan-indigenous scale, but can be pinpointed down into very particular regions. So that kind of became how I thought through the vision of what is Natives.
And then in 2017, your cookbook, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, came out. Year later, 2018, you won a James Beard Award. How did that feel?
That felt really great. Right away, I had met this woman. She was living in Norway, but she was from Minnesota, and she was a photographer. Somehow she had heard a radio piece or seen something online about the work that I was doing, I think even before I officially formed the sous chef. And she was just really interested in wanting to know how to work with me, and she just really pushed me to say this should really be a cookbook. Her name was Nancy Bunt, and she had a long career of photography, and she was even Prince's personal photographer on the Purple Rain Tour, so she was the only photographer on the entire Purple Rain Tour. So she introduced me to Beth Dooley. I don't remember how she met Beth, but Beth and I started working on this book concept right away, and Beth had already pushed out a lot of cookbooks in the Minnesota, Minneapolis area. She had been really comfortable working with University of Minnesota Press, so we ended up just making a deal with them and signing up for this book concept. So we worked on it from the beginning of 2015 all the way till we turned it in, and it was released late 2017. And then I remember Beth and I went to that award ceremony, and we were the very first one that got called out during that award ceremony. And I just remember it was kind of a blur. I just thought there was a chance in hell we would win this, because it was never the intention to make something like that. I really wanted just to put it out there in the world because it didn't exist, and I wanted to do something that we could use for education as we were doing a lot of this traveling and speaking engagements and sharing and all this stuff. And then it just felt amazing to be called out to win something that big at the time, and just to be able to take that platform.
Well, then a year later in 2019, you won another Beard Award.
Yep, and that one was really great because we had a cohort of other leadership award winners with us, and I remember Leah Penniman was part of that with Soulfire Farms, and there was just a lot of really cool people in the mix of that, and I just felt really good that the James Beard Foundation was really reaching out and supporting some of these pieces, because I feel like historically a lot of their awards were not going to people of color, and really kind of maintaining the status quo of just, Eurocentric food stylings and culinary. So to be able to hold those spaces for me was huge.
Tell me about the building we're sitting in right now, where your restaurant, Owamni, is.
This building has quite a long history because it goes all the way back to the colonial history of Minnesota, particularly, even before Minneapolis was here. But, people started utilizing the power of where we are, which is the Mississippi River. And right where we are, right outside, there used to be this really powerful waterfall that was in its heyday 300 feet across and about 40 feet down in a single drop, with kind of a split rock that went up the middle of it that kind of split the waterfall into two parts. And the Dakota people that lived here, and there was a Dakota village on this side of the river that had been here for who knows how long, but their word for this area was called Owamni, which is described the waterfall, which kind of means place of the falling and swirling water. And the Anishinaabe, who settled in northern Minnesota, they call it the Great Split Rock, or Gitchigakabika. So this is a really special area because this is what became downtown Minneapolis. And as the colonial machine came in, removed the indigenous peoples from this particular area, They started, of course, the full colonial machine in full effect. So there's a lot of logging going on. There's a lot of homesteads and farms being put out. So they're processing everything here along the river because it's getting shipped from here downwards, because you can literally go all the way down to New Orleans from here and beyond. This building, we're sitting in was two old mills. One of them was called the Bassett Sawmill, and one of them was called the Columbia Flour Mill. And fast forward quite a few years later, a lot of those old buildings kind of went away. And then a Japanese restaurant came here. It was one of the first Japanese restaurants in Minnesota. It was the first place sushi came into Minneapolis, particularly. And it was called Fujiya, and it was built on these ruins. And then that ran from 68 till 1990 until it kind of just eventually fell into disrepair after nothing really moved in here afterwards. But it was a pretty popular space for about 3 decades. And then so the Park Board eventually acquired it and created a brand new park space because they want to make the riverfront more accessible. So they created a thing called the Waterworks, or the River First Initiative. And they want to make just the Mississippi River more usable for the community here. And this was kind of phase 1. So they put out an RFP in 2017. We applied literally right after the Kickstarter that we put out, and we won. So we became the vendor who would go in here to open up some kind of food establishment to be a part of this Park Board building. And so the Park Board had to build this out completely from scratch, and it took a while because it took from 2017 until 2021 when we actually got the doors open. So we just kind of had to wait for a while, and we enter a global pandemic towards the tail end of that too, which really kind of pushed the progress off for almost an entire year of getting this building ready to go. But everything works out the way it's supposed to, and we eventually did get open, and we're really lucky to be right in this very particular space.
And you opened in 2021.
July of 2021.
And a year later, you won your third Beard Award for Best New Restaurant.
Yep. I was up for 2 pieces for the Beard Awards. I was nominated for Best Chef of this region and also for Best New Restaurant in the U.S. I thought I had maybe a decent chance of winning Best Chef of this region that particular time, which a couple of chef colleagues from Minneapolis were with me there in Chicago. It was Jorge Guzman and Yia Vang, and none of us won. A chef from, I think, Milwaukee won that year or last year. And then when Best New Restaurant came up, I was just like, there's just no way, because we're not the fanciest restaurant. We're not a Blue Hill at Stone Barns or something like on that level. We're not a Linea. And, those awards always go to those like really big, super high-end places. And there was a lot of them. I can't remember how many restaurants were up in that category, but there was a lot. And we won. And it was, again, like just kind of almost a haze. Like I just went into a daze, and I don't even really remember what I said on stage. I know there's a video of it, but we were all just like so excited. And, again, so lucky to be able to hold a platform like that typically does not go to projects like this.
One of the things that you mention in your talks is the Dakota Sioux Expulsion Act of 1863, which made it illegal to be a Dakota in Minnesota, and which still has not been lifted.
Yeah, so from the research that I've looked through, the Dakota Expulsion Act of 1863 and the Ho-Chunk Expulsion Act of 1863, both of them happened at the same time period. The Ho-Chunk had nothing to do with the Dakota pushing back and trying to fight for their way of life. They were pretty happy finally after a long journey ending up in what is today Blue Earth, Minnesota and southern Minnesota. But because their land was deemed extremely valuable, they were really great farmers and they were growing a lot of stuff, and they just had a really beautiful space. People were not only jealous, but also very xenophobic and just really wanted them out. So they were able to include them in that entire community during that same time period of removing them. Everybody was rounded up, put into what is Fort Snelling today, and then survived an entire winter. And then eventually they were forced onto riverboats and shipped down the Mississippi to where the Missouri River meets up, and then shipped up the Missouri River into South Dakota, and then moved over to what it was the newly formed Crow Creek Reservation before South Dakota was a state. And that's where some of my mom's family line comes from, is that Crow Creek. So I have direct descendants that came from the expulsion of Minnesota. I want to say I can't remember the exact number, but a huge amount of the number of people that were put onto those boats died during that long journey because those boats were overpacked. There was a lot of sickness. There was very little comfort or protection from the weather. And so many perished just on that one particular boat ride. And then from what I can tell, during the Dakota Expulsion Act and Ho-Chunk Expulsion Act, Minnesota set up a bounty system. It was up to $200 for murdering an Indigenous person at that time period. And if you do the math of inflation, like what is $200 in today's money, it's a massive amount of money, and that act was passed through Congress, which becomes a law. Then as far as I could tell, that law's never been touched since then, and I think it's just still sitting there. That makes it literally illegal for a Dakota or Ho-Chunk person to be in the confines of Minnesota today.
How does that feel for you emotionally to be sitting here doing as well as you're doing?
I just think that there's a lot that we have to unpack with what is United States history, especially with the relations against people of color, primarily Black and Indigenous in the United States, because the United States has never come to its own terms of how it became this international power, utilizing stolen Indigenous land spaces to make an extreme amount of wealth. On top of that, utilizing a lot of stolen Indigenous people from Africa to build everything and forced into labor. I feel like today's world, we're still sliding backwards, because we have states making it illegal to teach African American history. South Dakota removed all Lakota history from its curriculum and school books. And we should not be hiding history. We should be telling everybody what happened, no matter how violent it was, because we just need to be better humans moving forward, So for me, it's a wake-up call that people should realize.
How do you define success?
That's a hard one to answer. I know that we've had a lot of successes. I know that we've had a lot of accolades. I know that I get a lot of attention, but I just really want to utilize this platform for something good, which is why when I do my talks, I literally go straight to talking about the violent history of the United States. And I just really want to open up doors and paths for people behind me to make it easier for them to have access to these things, to the education, to the knowledge, to the history, to the foods, and just to see a better way moving forward and to realize the true value, especially if you're coming from Black or Indigenous that our ancestors had, that can really be a very big positive moving forward, because our diets can be much better. We could have a lot more growing power. We have a better understanding of the world around us, the plants, how to utilize everything, have much more plant diversity in our diets in general, and just see the world differently and work towards protecting things, because we're all going to face a lot of these really harsh changes coming forward just in a global scale, because we're facing climate change. In the US, we're facing a water crisis, and that's going to go beyond here, obviously, and it is already. And these things are going to be really difficult for us because we're not that smart yet. I use Palm Springs as an example because Palm Springs, there's 120 green golf courses in the middle of the desert. And if we were smart, we'd be utilizing all of that space to grow food, because just one city could probably create enough food for almost that entire state alone, But instead, we're catering to the rich and we're catering to people who don't really care about others. And we need to really be thinking about humanity in general. And we shouldn't be relying on politicians, because politicians just argue amongst themselves, create division, and they're not being driven by the voice of the people. They're being driven by lobby money, and we need to change that. So the only thing we can do is just lead by example.
How do you define failure?
I think just not trying, really, when it comes down to it. Like, I feel like we all should try to be better. I think we all should learn from each other. I think we all should be accepting of diversities and not trying to homogenize things. And I think just by taking the act of not caring or not trying, I would define that as failure.
Can you name a personal or professional failure that ultimately set you up for success?
I mean, I think that as humans, we fail a lot in general and just basic projects constantly. I think in the restaurant business, you're always barely hanging on by a string. You're just doing your best to try and attempt to control chaos as much as you can. And there's going to be a lot of failures. You can't make everybody happy. You can't make every decision right. And that's just part of it. And I think we have to be acceptant of some failures, but ideally we learn from those failures to move forward, because every failure opens up a new understanding and a new path.
How do you define happiness?
There's a lot of basic needs that humans need in general. Obviously, we need love. Obviously, we need food, all of us. And I think just having that comfort of some of those things can really create that sense of comfort that we really need. And, I just want people to be able to experience that. We shouldn't have to go through the grind so heavy. I mean, we should be happy to chip in and help out our own community and help out others as we need to. And I think that happiness will come from that. If we're only feeding ourselves and only feeding our own egos, like it's not going to lead to happiness. I think we need to be a lot more open.
What would you say to 18-year-old Sean?
Oh, that is a tough question too. I don't know if I would tell myself to I didn't know what journey or what path I wanted back then. I knew that I wanted to experience life. I knew that I wanted to see music. I wanted to see art. I wanted to travel the world. And I don't know if I would change very much. I would maybe, I don't know. I think everything happened the way it was supposed to happen.
How would you describe what you do for a living?
I'm just attempting really just to be a role model to show what's possible. I'm trying to open doors for people. And, I do love cooking. I love cooking at home a lot. And I am happy that I'm able to create these businesses that are working, and I'm able to create so much jobs for other people. And it's hard to define exactly what I'm doing. And I just really want to continue doing this for the time that I have left with my working years, and hopefully in the future I'll find myself back on a beach in a tropical area and eat fruit and fish and enjoy life.
Chef Sean Sherman, thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you so much.
The Days Between is a production of Noah Abrams Studio. Story editing by Andrew Henry. Mixing and mastering by Greg Henkin. Website and design by John Fisher. Theme music is by Evo. The Days Between can be found online at www.thedaysbetweenpodcast.com and on Instagram at The Days Between Podcast. My name is Noah Abrams. Thanks for listening.